Ladies and gentlemen, I would love to welcome you to tonight's reading and talk with Elizabeth Currid-Halkett. My name is Micha Himpel. I'm the Culture Program Manager here at the German-American Institute, the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Institute in Tübingen, Germany. And I'm very happy to have Elizabeth Currid-Halkett as a guest tonight. She's here with her book, The Sum of Small Things, Theory of the Aspirational Class. And for our German watchers and guests, fair gehandelt, wie unser Konsumverhalten die Gesellschaft spaltet. First of all, I would love to thank our cooperation partner tonight, our local bookstore here in Tübingen, Buchhandlung Osiander. And special thanks go to Mr. Heinrich Riedmüller. Thank you for making this event possible together with us. And also I want to thank the BTB Verlag, it's the German publisher of the translation Fair Gehandelt. And before we start, if you want to know a bit more about us, about the German-American Institute here in Tübingen, please feel free to browse our website, follow us on social media, or sign into our weekly newsletter. Find all the information you need below in the video descriptions. And of course, if you want to get the book, you'll find them wherever you find books. But of course, you can get it locally here at Osiander Tübingen if you're from Tübingen, or you just order it online, possibly the most easiest way to get it. I want to give you a short event tip from our program here at the German-American Institute. We're turning 70 this year. Next week, we'll start our celebrations of our 70th birthday with this really special exhibition opening. You might see it in the back here behind me. It's Vivian Maier in the streets. We got pictures from Vivian Maier. We'll show an exclusive selection of 50 black and white photographies of Vivian Maier here in Tübingen until September 24th. And feel free to click in because our exhibit opening will be a hybrid event from our hall in the d.a.i, but you can also join online next week, May 4, 7:30 p.m. Central European Time, approximately the same time as now. But now I would love to start with our talk, and I would love to introduce Elizabeth Currid-Halkett very quickly to you guys. In 2002, Elizabeth Currid-Halkett got her master's degree in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 2006, she received her PhD in urban planning from Columbia University, New York. Currently, she's associate professor for public policy at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles and holds the James Irving Chair of Urban and Regional Planning. Her research topics are importance of the arts to the urban economy, the role of cultural capital in defining and perpetuating class inequality, as well as American consumer economy. Her work appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, and the Economist, among others. In 2007, she published her book, The Warhol Economy, about the influence of artists, designers, and other creators in New York City. In 2010, she published Starstruck, about the economics of celebrities. And today she's here with her book from 2017-18, The Sum of Small Things, and the German translation, which came out in July 21. And she lives near Los Angeles, and I'm more than happy to have you with us today. A huge digital applause, please, for Elizabeth Currid-Halkett. Thank you for being here, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much for having me, Misha. It's really an honor. I have been to your wonderful country a few times, so I was very excited to be invited to speak today. So today I am going to read from my book, The Sum of Small Things. In many ways, even though these seem like very disparate topics, you know, I studied art in New York and then celebrity in Hollywood, and then studying people's, consumption habits and how they link to social inequality. They seem different. but actually they have a common through line, and that is that I'm very interested in culture. I'm interested in how culture occurs and how it is different place to place. So this is my geographic and urban planning background. And I'm interested, and for a long time, I studied the production of culture. But in this last book, I'm very interested in our consumption of culture and why we choose to buy and consume what we do, and what are the larger social implications for that. So one of the things that's really interesting about the book is when I first started doing my research, I thought it would simply be a study of material goods. And I was very inspired by Thorstein Veblen and the theory of the leisure class. And what I found was that the very wealthy were not devoting enormous amounts of money to material goods, but rather to immaterial goods. So, when you are a researcher and you find something really different and new, you start digging in more. What are they spending money on? And it turned out that they were spending money on education and healthcare and retirement, things that I came to call inconspicuous consumption, and things that helped their cultural capital. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and you're welcome to ask me questions. And I then just really looked more broadly at the lifestyle of, the new elites, and the new elites being defined not just by money, but by their education and by their cultural knowledge in particular spheres. And so I'm going to read a few excerpts from my book that capture, I hope, the essence of what I was finding. And you may find some of this resonates with yourself. So I will read a short passage now, and then I will take questions, and I even have some data to show you if you're interested in looking at that, for those of you who are more data and statistics oriented. So the chapter I'm going to start reading from is chapter 3, Ballet Slippers and Yale Tuition, Inconspicuous Consumption and the New Elites. In the beginning, Essie Weingarten just liked nail polish colors. In 1981, Miss Weingarten packed up her bags and displayed her initial 12 nail polish colors at a trade show in Las Vegas. In her collection, she had, as she explained, a true red, a blue red, a pink red, and an orange red, along with the translucent pink and white tones that made her famous. Essie was the first in the business to push the sheer colors, of which Ballet Slippers has become the iconic shade among the Vanity Fairest, Baby's Breath, Sugar Daddy, and Mademoiselle. As Essie explained to me, I personally love the look, and nobody was doing it. In 1989, Queen Elizabeth's hairdresser sent a note to Essie requesting ballet slippers. Essie, number 162. As Essie recalls, about 2 years after it came out, I received a letter from the Queen's hairdresser, complete with the royal seal. I thought, I've arrived. In the decades since, Ballet Slippers and its sheer sisters have reigned supreme as the de rigueur nail polish colors for a particular group of women within Beverly Hills, New York's Upper East Side, and London's Kensington. Given the cult following by this aesthetically conscious elite group of women, and the Queen of England no less, surely there must be something special about ballet slippers, iridescent sparkles, unique mineral composition, or some attribute that would make its cult following so obvious. Yet once applied, the color hardly screams notice me, or I've just had a manicure. One coat leaves the nails a slight blush, two coats creates an opaque white with hints of pink. Rather, this delicate color, almost childlike, merely signals subtly that a woman grooms herself. My initial assumption about sheer nail polish among these high society women was that its prevalence was a function of these women's taking manicures for granted. Because well-groomed nails were such a quotidian part of their existence, it wasn't necessary to wear bold colors to announce the specialness of getting one's nails done. However, the phenomenon was quite the opposite. The women wore sheer colors precisely because their nails could never be taken for granted, given the circles they ran in and the events they attended. They were a rarefied group who needed nails that assimilated within their social lives. The sheer color then became a symbol of an elite world where one's appearance always mattered. Ballet Slippers is not worn by these women because it costs more. This nail polish is on the spectrum of affordable luxury goods. unlike the limited edition $20,000 Birkin bag or a rare vintage wine. High society women spend the same $7.99 for a bottle as the lady in a small town Pennsylvania pays for Essie's bright coral geranium, number 43, and yet both the Hermes bag and the ballet slippers are status signifiers nonetheless. Historically, professional manicures were very much relegated to high society and the affluent. Getting a manicure before the 1980s was really special, Essie explained. Before then, it was an outrage. Then things changed. Starting in the 1980s, with the increased availability of low-wage service workers located disproportionately in major cities, the price of manicures decreased such that the average women were able to go to the salon. And now women can pop into a salon and have their nails done for $15. Today, according to Euromonitor International, manicures are a $1 billion industry. Over a 6-month period, 27 million adults had salon manicures and 32 million had pedicures. The trend continues to increase. From 2010 to 2011, manicure rates grew by 24%. Thus, a former habit of high society was easily translated by the masses. For Essie, nail polish became a democratic means to a former luxury and status good of the social elite, a taste of high society within reach. Today, Essie Weingarter's eponymous nail polish, Essie, is a household name to so many an American woman and is sold in pharmacies and nail salons around the world. With the decrease in manicure price, new colors have become more popular: blue, black, green, and flesh shades, particularly because manicures are so inexpensive that women can change their nail polish without costing much. The manicure has become more disposable for everyone. And yet, despite this trend, many women in high society and the professional world still wear sheer colors. It's hard to say which came first, the subtle colors as a functional or practical manicure, or the fact that the subtle colors are a signal of a particular social position. Nevertheless, it is the way in which the manicure is translated, in other words, the color of choice, that makes all the difference. Unlike more material and ostentatious forms of conspicuous consumption, these nail polishes and the women who wear them illustrate a different barrier: the cost of information, and knowing the implicit details that define a particular social stratum. The choice of what color to paint one's nails is but one quotidian example of what the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would have called objectified cultural capital. In his landmark book, Distinction, Bourdieu argues that one's taste was less about specific paintings on a wall or the car one drove, and more about the cultural capital accrued through knowledge, social networks, and education that was indicated by those items. Cultural capital, as opposed to economic capital or money, is the collection of a distinctive aesthetics, skills, and knowledge, often attained through education and pedigree. Objective cultural capital suggests that particular objects gain cultural or symbolic value that transcends and is often greater than any monetary value assigned. And the social class is not produced through consumption. You can't buy your way automatically into the upper class, but rather it is attained through the adoption of values and aesthetics and the ability to decipher symbols and signs beyond materialism. These values, aesthetics, and tastes form what Pierre Bourdieu would have called the habitus of everyday life, the ways in which we view the world and make normative judgments from our particular vantage point, as, say, a rich white person in Manhattan, or a poor African-American in Mississippi, or a wealthy Latino in Miami, or a member of the bourgeoisie in small-town America. The habitus is not simply the consumption patterns, but the knowledge of what to consume. Thus, pale pink nail polish is the physical embodiment of the trappings of a particular social and economic class. The women know to paint their nails with ballet slippers as a commodified signifier of the cultural capital and habitus they glean from living on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Most consumption choices are made at the intersection of economic, cultural, and social values of particular classes, and they are consciously and unconsciously appropriated to sort different groups from one another. In an era where conspicuous consumption is accessible, social position is often truly defined by things we cannot see. Or as Vance Packer remarked in The Status Seekers, while Americans are ceremoniously egalitarian in their more conspicuous behavior patterns, they reflect, sometimes wittingly and often unwittingly, their class status by the nuances of their demeanor, speech, taste, drinking, and dining patterns and favorite pastimes. Similarly, in the 21st century, social status emerges not simply from cars or watches, but from inaccessible cues, information, and investments. For the aspirational class, these signifiers are what I call inconspicuous consumption. That is, more subtle, less materialistic forms of conveying status, particularly to others in the know. Sometimes these consumption choices aren't even intended to display status at all. Whether they are extraordinarily expensive versions of goods everyone buys or investments in the life chances of their children, these new forms of inconspicuous consumption are goods and services purchased for the sake of making one's life easier, improving well-being, both intellectual and physical. And yet, through both prosaic and profound inconspicuous consumption, these elites, whether the culturally rich aspirational class or just the rich, entrench their and their children's socioeconomic position. The rise in inconspicuous consumption is a result of three important trends. First, so much of material consumption is accessible and overt that the aspirational class, both consciously and unconsciously, finds more obscured codified symbols to reveal their social position. Second, there is no leisure class. The restructuring of the global economy prizes a meritocracy who owns the means of production through their minds, not land ownership. These labor market elites, many of whom are members of the aspirational class, believe in upward mobility and want the same for their children. Their dominant ethos, working hard, is also the dominant cultural hegemony and spills over into all walks of life. John Gershuni observes that the relationship between work and leisure in contemporary society suggests that those who earn a lot of money work very hard to maintain and maintain it, and thus leisure time is the scarcest resource of all. He also observes that much of the leisure time is increasingly filled with consumer activities, and to possess more leisure time, paradoxically, requires more work. Today's labor market elites, particularly those in the aspirational class, devote money to freeing up that time and making the best of it through paying dearly for childcare, housekeeping, gardeners, and luxury holidays. Finally, and most importantly, material consumption, particularly post-recession, is less valuable than investing resources into the consumption that counts. And that is education, retirement, healthcare, all of which price out ordinary people, but are critical conduits in the reproduction of the aspirational class position and further separating the rich from the rest. All of these latter consumption habits cost a lot of money, but are not ostensibly about revealing one's status, even if they actually do. Inconspicuous consumption thus takes two almost bifurcated forms. There is cost of information inconspicuous consumption, inexpensive and non-pecuniary signifiers such as nail polish and particular cultural knowledge. And there is cost prohibitive inconspicuous consumption, and that is incredibly expensive consumption such as childcare, healthcare, and college tuition, which both significantly improve quality of life for those who can afford it, and simultaneously reinforce and retrench existing class lines. I will discuss each of these types of spending in turn. The key, most of all, in all inconspicuous consumption is that it is non-visible except to those in the know, and it is difficult to emulate without tacit information or a significant amount of money. Inconspicuous consumption is the source of the new class divide. This use of non-pecuniary means to demonstrate status is not entirely alien from Veblen's time. Veblen observed and critiqued the use of manners and good breeding as a demonstration of status. Acquiring manners and demonstrating them took time and was often possible only for those who led a life of leisure, exemplifying two important qualities of Veblen's upper class. Language has also always been a means to show social position. Like manners, it takes time to acquire and practice particular word choices and turns of phrase. To quote the late social critic Paul Fussell, regardless of the money you've inherited, the place you live, the way you look, the time you eat dinner, the stuff you buy from mail order catalogs, your social class is still most clearly visible when you say things. Fussell goes on to discuss the pseudo-elegant style of the middle class, their discomfort in calling a toilet, rather it is a restroom or a lavatory or a powder room, a drunk, he is someone with an alcohol problem, or to comfortably swear words or use the word death, rather it is passing away or taken to Jesus. Conversely, they are self-conscious using words that the upper class use with reckless abandon, divine, outstanding, super, tedious, tiresome. In their place, the middle class use those umbrella words of banality, nice, and boring. These observations get to class distinctions that transcend money and material goods. They are the cost of information and the cultural capital that one accrues through knowledge. Unlike conventional status goods, the new means by which members of the aspirational class define themselves are through the goods that may cost just the same as they do for their middle class counterparts, but are only assessed through rarefied information. As showy and material means of establishing status are more accessible, the aspirational class finds subtle symbols, cultural capital, and languages to distinguish itself from other groups. And its members use knowledge as an important dividing line between them and the rest. And thus the aspirational class members shape and demonstrate their position through information they can attain only through their peers and as position purveyors of cultural capital. Just as Ballet Slippers does not cost more, there is a price to exist in an elite world where sheer nail polish is thought to be standard, and the same holds true for other aspects of inconspicuous consumption. Non-monetary, non-functional goods may cost the same price, but the cost of information, rather than the actual cost of the good, is what creates the barrier. And I'll stop now.
Thank you for the first impression of your book, and we can dive into it somewhat. And first of all, I want to start from the scratch. Like, what was your motivation to write it? How did you get into it? And how did you come across the topic of this? How did you,
So I've always been very interested in Thorstein Veblen's work on the leisure class. I loved the way in which he studied the symbols of social position. And I was very interesting to me when I studied cultural goods because, they're subjectively valued. I mean, why is a Mark Rothko painting worth more than that brilliant artist, living in Brooklyn, So there's such subjectivity to cultural good, and they're so tied to status. So I always was inspired by that. So I began by actually looking, and this sounds kind of funny, but, Veblen's, one of his most famous examples were silver spoons. So he said, people, the leisure class use silver spoons because they cost more, not because they're more functional than lesser value materials. And so I started looking at who spends the most on silver spoons in America. And I looked at the government's data they have this data set called the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And you can look at everything. You can't get brand names, but you can get like diapers and childcare, all sorts of stuff. So I went in there and I started looking at, flatware. And it turns out that the super rich, certainly when I was studying this data, were not spending the most on silver spoons. And it was the middle class. And I thought, well, this is an interesting story. So I started panning out and I created a bundle of goods that defined conspicuous consumption. And I realized that it was not the top income groups that were devoting most of their money, both in absolute dollars and as a proportion. Actually, in absolute dollars, they might be super, super rich just simply because they have more money. But in terms of proportion of what they spend their money on, they were not spending the most on conspicuous consumption. It was actually lesser, income groups that didn't have as much money. And so I started saying to myself, well, what are the rich spending money on? And I found this whole group of goods that they were spending enormous amounts of money on, which were immaterial. And it made me realize things had really changed a lot. And I wanted to understand why.
Sorry, missed
Okay.
the mute button. You refer to, maybe to the audience that is not as deep into the topic, you refer to Thorstein Veblen and his theory of the leisure class, which inspired you, as you said, or as we can read. And the Thorstein Veblen wrote this in 1899, so it's a quite old work, and it's interesting that you still can draw comparisons to our time today. What would you say? What is the key focus in his theory in relation to your theory?
Oh, that's a great question. So, Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption has become a commonplace, word. I mean, if you read the New York Times or the equivalent in Germany, or you read The Economist, or listen to Vox, whatever it is, the term is used to describe overt materialism to show social position. So even though he wrote, well over 100 years ago, the term has really resonated. And I think a huge part of it is that in a capitalist society, and where you see such social hierarchy, some of which is very much defined by economic means, that this kind of consumption was a way to show one's social position. And I think what I would argue is that the rules of the game have changed. I mean, he's not incorrect, but so many things have changed. So, the access to material goods has become much more democratized. Today, if you wanted a silver spoon, you don't have to be in the leisure class. You can order it on Amazon. So this idea that material goods, and it's not to say that they don't matter at all, but there's this new dominant way in which social status is defined. And I sort of turn this idea on its head, which is that, conspicuous consumption is now something so many people can engage in, that what do you do if you're really rich or you're a part of some meritocratic elite? What does your social status look like? And that's where I found there were these other quirky ways in which this occurred, some of which were very expensive. So that's just clear. Like, can you write a check for $60,000 for your kid to go to college? That shows your social position. But on the other hand, you have things like what music you listen to, what books you read, what podcasts you listen to, even what kind of car you drive. I mean, there's this thing in the States a few years back where they called the Volvo the car of stealth wealth, because, it's not fancy. It's not a Ferrari. It's not a BMW, but it's actually a very expensive car, at least in America. And it was driven an awful lot by this kind of upper meritocratic elite, upper class.
So you refer to this democratization of conspicuous consumptions, where wealthy, I'm a bit redundant, but I want to make this clear to the audience. People used to be able to show off their wealth in possessing wealthy goods like expensive cars and stuff. And as I read in your book, like in the mid 1990s to the 2000s, authentic clothing and accessories were diffusing the lines, as you said, between expensive and affordable high quality goods and mass produced like luxury clothing began appearing in shopping malls in downtown centers. And is there a point somewhere where would you say this was the starting point of an aspirational class evolving, people actively looking for other ways to express their wealth? Or was this a very slowly emerging process? Where is it? Can you grasp the beginning of the aspirational class? You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah, I do. I don't think it was a light switch. I think that's what you're trying to say, is there was this kind of moment. But I think that, what you're talking about, which is fast fashion, is a huge part of this. So the democratization of goods is, the mass production of goods that are much less expensive, that are produced in China. There's also fast fashion, which is, that skirt really does look like something that Celine had on the runway, but it's, $30, not, $2,000. So that, and then you do actually have just the whole knockoff market. So that's a whole part of the way in which I believe material goods lost their luster. I think at the same time, something very important is that today's elite are meaningfully different. I mean, I am not the first to say this, but the rise of the meritocracy, I mean, yes, a lot of them have money. They're in the top 10%, the 5%, the 1%. But what they really possess is education, elite education, and they are part of the managerial professional classes. And actually, their value system is very different. I mean, they're not a leisure class. They're an elite, but they are not a leisure class. And so that also has, I think, really shaped what their values are. So if you're in the leisure class and you own lots of land and education is, at best you study, classics, but which you are in some ways at that time would have been gratuitous because you weren't necessarily going to use it for anything. It's very different if you're, you went to Princeton, you're a lawyer, you want your kids to do something the same. Your whole the way in which you use your money and your goals and what you think is important to the world is very different. So I think you have the rise of a new elite, you have the democratization of material goods. And I'll add another thing that I think is really important. A huge component of the aspirational class is that there is this desire on some level to be a better human, whatever that looks like. It's buying organic food, it's exercising all the time, the wellness industry writ large. And so one thing that's really become very clear is like that our goods are mass-produced goods are produced in places where there's sweatshops, the environmental impact of having too much stuff. I mean, so these are values that then have been absorbed. So then you see again, if it's a group of people who care so much about knowledge and culture and making good decisions, or what they believe are good decisions, that also reflects in what they buy, which is why they're going to the farmer's market and Whole Foods and the organic and the recycling and etc.
And it's interesting because, well, your data is based on American consumption and refers to United States of America, but I think it's interesting for us here to draw the parallels. I don't know if you're able to draw parallels to other countries. Do you see, is there a possibility to references to other countries? For instance, I don't know if you're into like Germany or other countries where you see similar developments?
Yeah, so as a researcher, I'm always very careful. Like my data is US, so I can only say this is what I see in the US. But I'm Irish. I'm the first American, and my husband's English, and so we go to that part of the world a lot. And so even as I was writing this book, I was seeing, at least anecdotally, just existing there, that the same thing was going on. And then when my book came out, international journalists would contact me and they would say, this is happening in Italy, this is happening in France. So yeah, I mean, I have to be careful because I need to be careful that I only speak with affirmation about things I've studied. But if anecdotally, absolutely, I think this is a phenomenon of Western capitalist countries, and probably extends beyond. But I do believe if you look at continental Europe, United Kingdom, United States, you see an awful lot of this.
And I would say very clearly you can see these parallels here in Germany as well, like this whole drive of going to farmers markets for like a biological, like a bio-elite is it in Germany, like yes. People buying biological, very, yes, doing yoga, Pilates, and all the things you mentioned. We have that here very much. And a very important factor in your book is like the time and the availability of time, and time as a luxury good. What do you think? What does have time to do with this? Like to make the most use of your time, or yes, time as a luxury good. Like a lot of people from the aspirational class use time to do sports, or not to just, as you said in your book, not to just do their work and what they actually have to do to survive, but use this thing of time, No,
I actually talk a lot about time in some of the presentations I give in my work, because so time is the scarce resource now. If you're not dealing with a leisure class, a gentry, you're dealing with people who really work hard, whether you're a lawyer or a medical doctor or a university professor, whatever you are in this kind of broad meritocratic aspirational class, that is something that's precious. The thing that makes you different from the hourly worker, who, by the way, also doesn't have a lot of time, is that you make a lot of money, So what I find has happened when you look at the consumption data is what they do is they buy back time. So they buy time with a housekeeper or flexible childcare that allows them childcare when they need it, but they can, they can have the childcare at certain times and not at others, rather than, oh, my child has to go to a daycare. They don't do their own gardening. They don't do their own laundry. They don't mop their own floors. And then suddenly you find hours back, but that costs a lot because that's human labor and it's expensive. And to contrast it, if you are an Uber driver or you work in a grocery store, you also don't have a lot of time, but you don't get paid enough to buy, to buy services. So I think that's a big part of the time. The other thing that's interesting is that I think the aspirational class kind of can't get away from the productivity. So you find, particularly pre-pandemic, that people use that free time to still be productive. I'm going to go and do an hour of Pilates, and I'm going to catch up on all my book review, the New York Book Review and the London Review of Books. I'm going to, because I have to be knowledgeable too. So even leisure time becomes productive because it's actually how you amass that cultural capital.
Do you think, let's put it that, is it desirable to be part of the aspirational class? Because if we put it in comparison to, for many centuries, it was desirable to like this urge for, as you said, this conspicuous consumption. And does the aspirational class create a similar dynamic for people to overtly want to be part of the aspirational class?
Yes, well, and this is actually a very, I think, philosophically complicated. I think, of course, members of the aspirational class enjoy being a part of the dominant cultural hegemony. I mean, there is a premium on knowledge. And so to be a member of, to be able to seamlessly fit into that world feels good. There's no question that having a college degree and being able to afford your children going to college is very important for social mobility. But again, I would not be the first one to critique the aspirational class or, the meritocracy in a general sense, in the sense that it is a bit of a treadmill. There is a sense of always being productive, always, every decision around consumption is thought out so much. Some of this is good. It's definitely better that you're eating more vegetables and less Doritos, of course. And that is more expensive. And you have the opportunity to do that. But I think there is a kind of overwhelming treadmill aspect to the reproduction of it for your children. I think that's very, very difficult. The other thing that I have brought up before, and I mentioned in my book, is because there is this sort of ethos of environmental, cultural consciousness and so forth, I think that people can, in this, aspirational class members can kind of be inured to the larger class, issues of inequality. They're not doing anything wrong. It's not like, the 1980s Wall Street with the Rolex watch and the fancy car, and it's so obviously self-centered. It doesn't seem like that. You're shopping at Whole Foods and you're recycling and you're using your reusable tote bag and you're trying to spend less on material goods. So it all feels very good. And it is. It's better to do that than the other. But it doesn't, even the playing field for others. There's still massive education problems in the United States. There's still massive discrimination. There's the socioeconomic divides are huge, and they're not just, huge across geographies, even within the cities that the aspirational class live. And I don't think because you buy organic food that you're solving the problem. You're not contributing, but I'm not sure. I think we need to be a little more proactive.
Cool. Do you want to read another part for us?
Sure.
Cool.
I'd be happy to. I wasn't sure when to do that.
Awesome. No, it's cool.
Okay, so I'm going to read a section of my book that is about another kind of, I play around with this concept of conspicuous consumption in different ways. So this section of my book talks about the concept of conspicuous production. And I think you'll probably see some of it resonate in your own life. This particular story starts with a coffee shop, Intelligentsia. Intelligentsia, born out of Chicago in the late 1990s, is one of the first post-Starbucks success stories. Unlike Starbucks, which has 13,000 stores nationwide, Intelligentsia only has 9, a few in Chicago, 1 in San Francisco, 2 in Los Angeles, and a newly opened branch in Manhattan, near the High Line in Chelsea. The important thing to keep in mind when talking to anyone who works for Intelligentsia, it is that it is nothing like Starbucks, barring the fact that both companies have convinced consumers to spend $5 on a cup of coffee. However, where Starbucks adds a dollop of caramel and a cup or two of milk to make the consumer's money worth it and essentially creates a liquid dessert, Intelligentsia has managed to get consumers to spend the same amount for a plain cup of coffee, dairy and syrup not included. In fact, the line around the block at the Silver Lake shop is mainly for their slow-brewed obscure coffees from faraway parts of the world, not cappuccinos and certainly not the decadent 510-calorie pumpkin spice latte, which, if requested, would get you laughed right out of Intelligentsia onto Sunset Boulevard. Where Starbucks has made its fortune in bringing luxury to the masses, Intelligentsia makes its smaller fortune proclaiming its rarity. Intelligentsia belongs to an emerging group of companies focusing on specialty coffee. For most people, Starbucks would be the obvious example of such a good. However, Starbucks may be a step up from Maxwell House and Nescafé, but it mainly operates in a space that produces coffee-esque drinks where coffee is not necessarily the whole point. To put things in perspective, Starbucks is one of the biggest purchasers of dairy products in the United States. Specialty coffee companies are a different breed altogether. Intelligentsia's claim to fame is that it focuses on the coffee beans, how they are roasted, how the coffee is brewed, and perhaps most importantly, where the coffee comes from in the first place. I arrived one Wednesday morning to Intelligentsia's Glassell Park Roasting Works warehouse, where I was greeted by Mark Zambito, the manager of the Silver Lake Coffee House. Mark and I had met a few weeks back to talk about Intelligentsia as a consumer good, and in listening to his discussion of craftsmanship, select harvesting, green buyers, and in-house educators to train the baristas almost daily how to brew particular coffee beans, it became apparent that something else was going on. Most of us have been brewing some version of coffee since we were teenagers, but specialty coffee is more akin to wine and tea or than Coca-Cola. But specialty coffee is more akin to wine than tea or Coca-Cola. And the process of acquiring beans and roasting them, never mind actually making a cup of coffee, took such an amazing amount of time and resources that I was surprised a cup of Intelligentsia coffee didn't cost more. Zambito is the picture of Silver Lake or Williamsburg or any other hipster enclave. Thin, small, wearing a tie and vest, Zambito is soft-spoken. But when he does talk, it is clear that he is incredibly knowledgeable about all things coffee and is equally passionate. Zambito doesn't spend much time talking about how good Intelligentsia's coffee tastes. In fact, he focuses mainly on the process of making good coffee, starting with how the company acquires the beans. As he explains, coffee cherries, that's what they are before they are picked and roasted into coffee beans, do not ripen evenly in a bundle. So in order to get ripe cherries, they have to be hand-picked and then put in water to see which cherries sink and which ones float. And then the ripe floating ones are skimmed off for production. If you're Starbucks with 13,000 stores, the sheer cost of labor for all that hand-picked coffee would be prohibitive. But for Intelligentsia, it's possible. Of course, in order to handpick the right coffee cherries at a large scale that serves several major American metropolitan areas, Intelligentsia still needs some larger structure of operation and a good, trustworthy relationship with coffee farmers, most of whom live and grow coffee in East Africa and Central America. Intelligentsia gets farmers to fastidiously pick perfectly ripe cherries by simply paying them more. Starbucks, famous for its fair trade, which has been criticized as a bit of a misnomer, doesn't hold a candle to the practice of direct trade, whereby Intelligentsia worked with the farmers themselves, removing the middleman. According to those I spoke with at Intelligentsia, this practice gives farmers 25% more money than fair trade, and also allows Intelligentsia not only to supervise harvesting, but also to enforce fair labor practices and environmental sustainability, both essential aspects of the company's policies. Intelligentsia sends staff to far-flung parts of the world to develop relationships with farmers, establish trust, and then oversee the farms and harvesting processes. This part of the company is wholly separate from the coffee roasting, brewing, and selling business. This area of the business is run by Jeff Watts, one of the owners of Intelligentsia and a green coffee buyer for the company. He was charged with acquiring the unroasted, immature green-colored coffee beans, essentially the beginning stage of the entire process. Watts is the opposite of Zambito. He looks nothing like a Silver Lake denizen, and the people he employs or patronize Intelligentsia. The day I met him, he was wearing a flannel checkered shirt without a hint of irony. He had nice, thick, floppy hair and looks like he'd be more comfortable in Humboldt County than in the heart of Los Angeles. Watts' business acumen and articulation are so impressive that I asked him where he got his MBA. He replied that he had a bachelor's degree in philosophy and mainly picked up the knowledge on the job. Watts used to oversee all of the coffee buying, but as Intelligentsia grew, more buyers were necessary, and now he only manages 20%. But that 20% requires detailed dedication and extensive research. We see coffee farmers as our partners, and we need a team. We can invest in roasters and baristas, but how coffee is grown is 60 to 80% of the coffee, so we need them to do a good job. We went down there to Central America and saw how destitute the farmers were and that they were making bad coffee, but not because they can't make better coffee, but because they didn't have the resources. Watts continued, emphasizing his point with his hand. You need to plant the right coffee, harvest selectively. We pay them to pick only the right fruits and put them in hermetically sealed bags to protect them. If they can do this, we'll pay a really good price. We also pay based on the real cost of production, not the futures market like other coffee buyers. We invest in a lot of these farmers so that they have finances, resources, and knowledge. We bring them to our stores, bring them all together to meet the other farmers. We bring in scientists on the frontiers of coffee quality research so they can learn, and they learn from each other. A farmer from Kenya will show an El Salvadorian farmer the techniques and vice versa. With roasting machines in Los Angeles and Chicago, the company is able to roast all of its own beans, primarily selling in its own stores, but also to other small specialty coffee shops, and more recently to Whole Foods and other upscale grocery stores. This is another interesting aspect of their production process. Intelligentsia has managed to acquire some of the latest of the last of the Gothot ideal rapid roasting machines, highly sought after roasters from the 1940s and 1950s that are no longer made. Stumptown Specialty Coffee, with 8 locations nationally, also uses the 1950s era Probot roasters, the company that bought out Gothot. And this is a selling point for them too. Standing next to one of these machines as the coffee beans were being churned out slowly and methodically, I asked the roaster why these machines were better than something more technologically advanced. The flames for roasting, he explained, were at the top rather than at the bottom of the roasting tin, which allows for a more gentle and precise roast. While I still can't figure out why Probot doesn't just make more of these machines, without question, the rarity and the return to a previous era is part of the appeal, along with the distinct taste of the coffee beans. All parts of the production process are transparent. When you buy a pound of coffee from Intelligentsia, you will see the farm, country of origin, roast. Every aspect is outlined on the bag. After all due diligence, it would be hard to say that Intelligentsia is ripping anyone off with their $5 coffees. This coffee company really cares and spends a shocking amount of time on getting things right. This dedication, from the very first green coffee cherry to the small cup of coffee sold at Chelsea's Highline Hotel, housed in an old seminary, is remarkable. Intelligentsia workers, whether baristas or the founders of the company, are both knowledgeable of and involved in every precise aspect of production process. And this process is tied inextricably to the company's identity and unique selling points and actual product. All of this is what makes the coffee taste so good, both physically and metaphysically. Intelligentsia would have attracted employees like Watts and Zambito, but it couldn't successfully sustain a business with lines out the door in the heart of Los Angeles and Manhattan if it didn't have consumers who cared about the exact same things. Consumers' desires for these less ostentatious forms of consumption is crucial to understanding conspicuous production's success. And I'll read one section here on Whole Foods. We may thank Starbucks for introducing the idea of a $5 cup of fair trade Kenyan coffee, but Whole Foods is the mainstream, mass-produced leitmotif of the conspicuous production movement. Founded in 1980, Whole Foods emerged from the bohemian tradition of Trader Joe's and the crunchy Berkeley Bowl, and somewhere along the way started selling arugula and chard for $5 a pop. Over the course of the last several decades, Whole Foods founder John Mackey has transformed his natural food store, originating from his Austin apartment, into a $9 billion plus enterprise with more than 300 locations. People who shop at Whole Foods are not oblivious to its contradictions of capitalism. Affectionately called Whole Paycheck, the grocery store beams purity, goodwill, and a return to nature, but all at a shocking price tag that is unaffordable for most of society. Whole Foods shoppers know that they can get organic tomatoes for half the cost at Trader Joe's or even the local chain. But the grocery store creates an entire shopping experience that for many is worth the price. Even people who probably don't earn the income to afford luxury food, those same unemployed playwrights and artists buying $5 cups of coffee, end up in the store's deli buying sweet summer kale salad for $11.99 a pound. Since the regional stores have quite a bit of autonomy, local distinctiveness emerges. In New York City's Columbus Circle location, jazz plays softly while others, like the Orlando, Florida outpost, offer chair massages. Glendale, California's Whole Food doesn't offer massages, but Indian music plays in the background with a pressed juice and coffee bar at the entrance. Even though shopping at Whole Foods is not marginally but significantly more expensive than other places. Many still trek to Whole Foods every week, telling themselves that the food is better, there than anywhere else and other more convenient places. But consumers may be telling themselves something because they want to believe it. I am not a foodie, so these minor nuances in taste are lost on me, but I end up shopping here too. Honestly, I, like many a fellow grocery shopper, go to Whole Foods mainly because of the Whole Foods experience. The stores tend to be relatively big, not very crowded, and they offer very effective checkout lines even in the heart of Manhattan. There is reasonably good music and coffee, juice bars, various amenities offered while shopping. And then there's humane chicken and strawberries without pesticides and weirdly colored vegetables that make a consumer feel virtuous and counterbalance the bars of chocolate and coffee cake that may also be piled in their cart. All of these items have stories of the places where they are created and the people who create them built into their branding. Zen muffins from a small neighborhood in Los Angeles, whole milk with a little picture of the farm where the cows roam freely and happily, Mary's free-range heritage farm turkeys from California's San Joaquin Valley, and yes, Intelligentsia Coffee. This storytelling is so effective that even the chocolate and the coffee cake seem less bad, maybe even good for you compared to other forms found in other grocery stores, even though surely they are not. Whole Foods makes you believe that you are a better global citizen and a healthier person by shopping there, even if the calorie count, nutrition facts, and price tag will quantitatively and insistently tell you otherwise. A wide-scale Stanford study research project studying the importance of organic foods compared to conventional fruit and vegetables revealed that the former were no better for us in a meaningful way. Or more plainly put, as my son's pediatrician warily remarked to me when I was discussing Plum's organic peach baby puree with him, he said, "Did you eat organic when you grew up? I didn't. We're fine, aren't we?" But Whole Foods' success isn't about organic products or better tasting food. Whole Foods' secret lies in how it effectively creates an identity and a story to which people wish to subscribe. The key to understanding Whole Foods and the whole conspicuous production movement itself is recognizing that it is about the process and its implications rather than the product itself. Buying Whole Foods groceries signals consumer awareness, an animal rights ethos, environmental consciousness, and more broadly, and perhaps most significantly, being an informed and conscientious member of society, just like Intelligentsia does on a much smaller scale. One does not attain such attributes at a local Safeway or Giant grocery store, which, fair to say, is a neutral shopping experience at most. To understand the powerful consumer identity of Whole Foods, simply consider that it's one of the only chain grocery stores to even offer one. And that's it. I can read more if you'd like, but I wanted to stop there and check in.
Thank you so much. No, it's so interesting. I think it hits the nail on the head. It's like if you say it's like a shopping experience worth the price. Like this sentence is like, or like by shopping, for instance, at Whole Foods, you're like this being to become a better global citizen. It's so interesting. This, do you think, and with the coffee, your examples with the coffee, it's in the end, it's all about money, like having more money and being able to spend the money in the right place, like spending the money in order to achieve, for the coffee example, better conditions for the farmers, vice versa, better coffee for the consumer. And is this somewhat, I'm not quite sure if I picked the wrong English word for it, but is it like a modern selling of indulgences?
Yes. I mean, I think the thing that's interesting is even though ostensibly it feels like it's about the environment and it feels about like it's about awareness, it's still commodified. Yeah. I mean, it still has a price tag, and it has quite a hefty price tag at that.
And let's do the twist on this a little bit. How important to bring it, like you wrote your book in 2017-18, you published it there. We have the German translation since last year here. It's 4 years since then. We have a pandemic in between. How do you think did the pandemic its part on the aspirational class? Did it push the development? Did it lower the development? What do you think? How is the whole development within the whole pandemic influence?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I think it's actually really has changed things. It has amplified certain things and I think depressed others. So I'll go with what has been amplified. Even since I wrote this book, if you can believe, in Los Angeles, there's an even more fancy wellness grocery store. It's a place called Erewhon. which is sort of nowhere spelled backwards, and I think is actually linked to the historical dystopian novel. So anyway, it makes Whole Foods seem affordable. And I think there's been a lot of that popping up. So I think Whole Foods is like the pioneer, but it obviously was a very successful model. So you see that continue. I think very linked to this is the wellness industry, which all of these grocery stores play into. And so I think that actually some parts of this, doing good for our body, doing good for the planet, that has exploded even more. I would argue that, the wellness industry, and I take my supplements and do my yoga too, but there is no question that it's become very self, and in some ways you can't blame us. I mean, we were self for how long in lockdown and pandemic and not being able to be outward. So you can see you can see how that would happen. But that I think has really increased. I think what has also increased has been inequality. And we know this. I can't speak for Germany, but in the United States, some of the very things we talk about or I write about, with inconspicuous consumption, education, healthcare, and retirement. I mean, education was terrible if you were, a middle class, working class member of society. Homeschool was a disaster. So many kids were left behind. So many kids weren't showing up. It's really a huge tragedy in the United States. People didn't make as much money. They lost their jobs. I mean, huge numbers of people, although not the meritocracy. I mean, so many of them just pivoted to home. And then healthcare, we know that there were disproportionate impacts with the pandemic, particularly on people who made less money. I mean, there's no question there was a socioeconomic implication. The thing I think is really good that has happened is some of that overachieving with our leisure time. I think a lot of the world has rethought that. I get this sense that idleness is a little more celebrated. Just hanging out with your kids in the garden is something that's worth doing with your time, and maybe skipping an exercise class or reading the Wall Street Journal. So I think that some of the kind of overzealous productivity, need for knowledge, being on top of everything, even that, manifested in the leisure time of the aspirational class, I think there has been a bit of a return to maybe that doesn't matter as much as just the people in my lives.
And how do you think has social media added to the image of the aspirational class, the use of social media?
So I will admit, I am not a social media person. I am somebody that very early on thought of it as not a good use of my time. I don't judge it for other people, but it doesn't work for me. So I can't really comment on how it is used. Although what I will say is, of course, there's a huge conversation that we shouldn't be using it so much because it's a waste of time and we can't sleep. And so I think it'd be interesting to see. There has been this, I am certainly not a pioneer of coolness. I mean, I'm just a university professor, but I definitely have seen this kind of, aversion to social media as being some sort of badge of coolness. I'm like, oh wow, I'm actually kind of cool. I never think of myself like that, but not using Twitter, I guess that's sort of some sort of badge now.
I think it might be interesting to analyze that from a point of how to, for instance, Instagram and this whole social media enables people from the aspirational class or people who would love to belong to the aspirational class, but who just are able to pretend being part of that group throughout social media postings or whatever. It's
yeah. Well, I wrote about this in my second book. I think it is interesting how social media is essentially a way, it is another, form of which we, reveal status. It becomes a great platform to reveal these social positions. But to your point, even there's this sort of verisimilitude to it. It is in fact like a novel. It is this sort of sense of something's true that may not be,
Wow. So interesting. One last thing, because that interested me very much, because for your book, let's see for your book, you analyzed the results of the Consumer Expenditures Survey right? Is it like for the German followers? It's like a household survey that collects information on the buying habits of the U.S. Consumers. And was that a main part to analyze these like huge, I'd say, data pools of information about the consumer goods, or where did you start? Where did you just try to start to grab your information for your
that's
research?
what I did. I mean, honestly, like any quantitative research, I mean, you're in the weeds for a while, you know. I mean, I was literally with my doctoral student line, okay, this is putting, you know, different items into bucket. And then, you know, then you run the regressions and look at the descriptive data and it becomes clear, but it's very hard work. I mean, if we have a moment, I can actually show you a couple of those charts if you want me to.
Sure.
You want me to? I'll just share really briefly because I know we're almost out of town or out of time. This is a talk I actually gave at Stanford, but I'm going to just show you some of the, so this is an example of some of the data that I use. So you can see over time, you know, we divided it into different income groups, and the top 1% you see is spending more on inconspicuous consumption and less on conspicuous consumption, where you see the middle class never really spends much on inconspicuous and didn't in any way drop after the recession. So one of the things that's really interesting is seeing that after the recession, a real reconfiguring of consumption habits by the top income group. Another example here, this is a different way of looking at it. And then I show this, which is like, this is childcare. Like, look at the top 1%. They spend so much more than anyone else on childcare. And it's probably because they can afford nannies and however else you want to define it, but they're not, you know, they have an enormous amount of flexibility. Same thing with musical instruments. This is one of my slides I use to describe cultural capital. You know, you see huge amounts of money being poured into music or art or whatever for these, you know, for the, you know, the adults or even and their children to cultivate this kind of cultural capital. And then this is my favorite. And actually, I've redone the numbers. I have even more recent numbers that are even more alarming. How much more these top income groups spend than everyone else. I mean, if you look here, the middle class is this gray dotted line. So they, despite education in the United States really increasing in terms of the cost, it's so expensive now. They have never changed their spending habits. But you see the top groups, it's not just absolute dollars. I mean, in sheer proportion of what they use their money for, education is a huge outgoing for them. And so you can see how this social mobility issue, as it relates to class, is so important, you know, but that's an example of some of the data I used.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I think this was awesome. This was an awesome insight into your book, The Sum of Small Things, A Theory of the Aspirational Class. To all of you out there who want to buy this, get it. Here's the German version, wrong side. This one, fair gehandelt in Germany. And thank you so much. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to have you here in our online talk. And the last words to you, Elizabeth.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. It was really a lovely time. And, you know, I have a website. So if you want to read some of my essays on these topics and anything about my new book, you're welcome to take a look there. But I really enjoyed my time here, and I thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you to you in the audience, and see you all soon, maybe on another talk. If you feel free to share this talk, it stays online on our homepage, and share it with your friends and family. And maybe this Easter is already over, but maybe this is a lovely new present for your loved ones. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.